You will also be receiving an email at the end of this event with a few resources that our webinar guests might speak of, as well as a link to the recording. Well, with that, I wanted to take a few minutes and do a level set. So today we're going to be talking with Brad Boswell from Boswell Consulting and Louis Horowitz from Lane Powell. Hi, Brad. We'll start our conversation with you. So before we dive in, I wanted to just give a level set of where we're at with long-term care and the Long-Term Care Act. As a reminder for, I think, everyone who is on this webinar today, a few years back, the legislature passed the Long-Term Care Act that was supposed to go into effect in January of 2022. I can't believe it's already February of 2022, but here we are. And in that act, there was a provision for exemptions, talked about the level of coverage, all of those sorts of things, which has caused quite the stir as of late. And as we go through today's program, really the goal is to help employers identify what do I do next and where are we at in this process, and answer those two questions. We understand, I understand this is a very politically charged topic in a lot of cases. So for all you listening and watching today, we are going to do our best to just really try and answer those two questions of where we go from here without kind of a political opinion left or right on that. So welcome, Brad. Good to always see you. Appreciate your time today. Could you start by giving us a little overview of, what just happened in the last month with the legislature, the governors signed it, like where are we at in this process, and what has happened this month to the Long-Term Care Act?
Sure, thanks, Sarah. It's great to be with everyone today. So in terms of the legislative process and what has happened over the last month, so in if not record time, very, very quickly for the legislative process, the legislature introduced and passed all the way through House, Senate, and signed by the governor, 2 pieces of legislation. The one probably most important at this point is the delay of 18 months of the implementation of the program. That is now passed and implemented. I'll let Louis kind of talk about sort of some details, but that is passed and going. The other legislation that passed relative to this was House Bill 1733, which provided some additional exemptions from this program, specifically for disabled veterans, as well as folks who live out of state and work in Washington. Again, that's sort of the process. The actual legislative process at this point for this session is finished from a technical standpoint. The bills are passed. There will be ongoing discussions of issues around this. I think that certainly the proponents of this legislation were there. I think there was a lot of surprise at just how kind of much the public paid attention to this, as well as sort of how quickly some of the problems became apparent, especially how many folks actually sought long-term insurance and then got exempted. How many folks, they're still not sure exactly how many folks these current exemptions are going to pull out of the program. All of these things really create a lot of questions around the financial solvency, how to make this program financially solvent, and then obviously how to fund that. So over the next 18 months, the Long-Term Care Task Force, which is a group of both stakeholders and then legislators, are going to be studying kind of the actuarial analysis, the financial analysis of what to do, and then bring back a series of recommendations for the legislature in 18 months. But during that time, the employer community is not going to be paying this tax. There is some, instructions on if you did collect the tax and how to remit back to the employees who you collected from. Again, I can let Louis sort of talk about that.
So right now, it went through the House and the Senate. the governor has signed it. Is that correct?
Correct.
So this pause is official.
Yes.
So for the next 18 months, employers are not having to collect or remit that premium or tax to the state. So right now, for all intents and purposes, there's nothing happening for the public on long-term care. And the legislature, it sounds like this session and next, are going to be looking at it to see what any changes need to be made to the program.
Correct. As I said, there will probably continue to be political theater and discussions around it, but as far as the actual legislative implementation, that is finished.
So can you talk to me a little bit about, some of the other political theater or some of the other things happening? I know there's a lawsuit out there. There's a lot of political, positioning and such. What comes next? What should people be paying attention to as we sort through this?
Right. So one of the questions that certainly comes to me, and as we walk this line around what's political and what's not, you get the question of, number one, what kind of changes could be made to make this work? There's going to be efforts to try and figure that out. The other question is, how do we get rid of this? And there's two options between now and the next 18 months, either a litigation pathway that may create some sort of position to change it or remove it. The other is potentially some sort of initiative or ballot measure. Again, I have not heard yet that there is an initiative effort. I know that there was some effort before the cutoff for signature gathering, which wasn't successful, but I do not know if there is going to be something emerge on that front. There is, I've heard some public indications that litigation is going to begin and start moving forward. So those are two things to be paying attention to. The other is, as we go forward, a lot of these meetings of the long-term care task force are going to be public. There's going to be, I'm sure that they're going to seek input from the public. At the very least, they're going to be diving deep from an actuarial perspective on just how much this is going to cost and what kind of revenue structures are going to be needed to sustain it. I think one of the other wild cards out there, and it isn't directly linked to the long-term care. However, it's going to be hard to sort of not have the two issues bleed in, and that is the current insolvency or expected insolvency of the paid family leave program. Both of these were supposed to be housed at Employment Security Division, and that is also creating a crisis in the legislative process as well. Again, they are not the same thing, but those kinds of questions around social benefit systems tend to bleed into each other. And certainly everything that we're hearing around the paid family leave is that they're going to have to infuse somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion into that system just to keep it solvent for the next couple of months. So that's a near-term problem that the legislature is going to have to deal with. But over the next 18 months, they're going to figure out just how the math is going to work.
Yeah, it's those financial not roadblocks. They kind of are roadblocks. The financial stuff is really going to play into kind of what happens and where we go from here. Well, I'm going to invite Lewis to join us, and then Brad for you to join us at the end as we go through some Q&A. So that's where we're at. The program is paused right now, and Lewis, welcome. Looking forward to talking to you on the beach. I hear that sure makes this conversation that much more enjoyable to see a beach, even though I know you're in your office in Seattle. Makes it pleasant. So talk to us about, what does this pause actually mean? What do employers do next?
Okay, so there's only two things you have to do. One as an employer and one as an employee. actually, there's three things. The first thing you have to do as an employer is if you collected the tax, you have to return the money to your employees. You have 120 days to do it. If you actually paid it over to the state, I don't know anybody that did that because any of my clients that tried that, the state wouldn't accept it. You have to return the money that you took. It's not taxable to the employee. You're simply reversing an error. And you have 120 days to do it. I do not recommend taking that 120 days. This is the employee's money. Return it as quickly as possible. That's the first thing you have to do. Second, if you took out your own personal long-term care policy as an employee, you should keep it. Pay the premium. I saw one of the questions in the chat saying sort of, what should we do if we bought our own plan? There are several reasons. I can think of 5 off the top of my head as to why you should continue to do that. The first is, if the program isn't repealed, you may actually need to show proof that you still have have a policy in place. Indeed, I don't think they're going to be reopening the window for anybody who gets a new policy. So don't think you can like cancel the old one and get a new one. Next, one of the problems with the original bill was that the exemption was a one-time exemption, and you had to say you had a policy on a date certain, November 1, and that you had to get your exemption and submit it by December 31. There was nothing to stop people from canceling their policies on January 2. I think that's a bad idea, and I told people that, but that was what some people were thinking. I think if the program continues, they're probably going to require at least a recertification in July of next year, and possibly annually or on some period thereafter.
Yeah, on that, I think the last Trust Commission meeting that was held, that was one of the things that was discussed, was how the regulatory process and the recertification will happen. So there are conversations happening around this, right? And a very, very good point for people.
And it's a critical point. The statute doesn't require that you have a policy any beyond December 31st of last year. So requiring someone to recertify something they're not required to have is going to require a legislative fix. I think it's a good idea, by the way, but it's not I don't know how you do that without the statute. The other thing is that, and at some point it becomes an administrative nightmare. You can imagine every employee in the state now has to annually recertify to their employers, and maybe annually go back on that state website and go through that process again. It's a political nightmare. Another reason not to cancel your policy if you're an employee is because it's not a bad policy to have. Now, many people acquired bare bones policies that were only marginally better than the state's policies. The problem with those policies and the problem with the state's policy is it really doesn't cover much. And I really believe that 10, 15 years from now, when people start looking to this, they're going to say, but I had coverage. And they're going to find out that $36,500 under the state plan, or the $50,000, which was the minimum under most of the private plans, doesn't buy much. Doesn't buy much today, much less in 10 years with a little inflation. So I think it's a good idea to keep those policies. There are a few exceptions to this general advice, if you're married to an active duty service member and you expect to move out of state before you get divorced, but so these are general rules. But for most people, if you have a policy, keep it. And then I said there were 3 things that you had to do now before I started rambling. The first was, we pay, if you're an employer, we pay the money. The second, if you're an employee and you obtained your own policy, keep it. The third thing you have to do is not worry about it. This program is going to see a lot of changes between now and enactment, including possibly repeal. I think that's a real chance in light of, as Brad commented, the incredible actuarial failures that are coming to light on the paid family leave, that's going to just scare a whole lot of people off over this program. So I don't know what's going to happen, but I wouldn't worry about it. So my general advice is have a glass of wine, relax, think about other things for the next year.
So, okay, let me repeat this back. You know my style. I like to make sure I heard you correctly, right? And repeat it back to you. So if you're an employer, you have 120 days to remit those, to give back that money to your employees if you withheld that from a January paycheck. You're saying, do that as soon as possible, right? Not taking that full 120 days, but that's kind of that limit there. Second, if you have a policy and we're in the process of applying for an exemption, don't do anything. Just keep that policy for all of the reasons that you were talking about. And, again, within the context of this program, the exemption process hasn't changed. So until and unless that changes, there's not a whole lot to be done there.
Exactly.
And third, I already forgot your third thing. Oh, don't worry.
Don't worry. Have a glass of wine.
Forget that important part. So, one of the questions that I've heard a lot of people talk about is, what if I didn't get a private policy, but I wanted one? Is there still time to? And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that and then have you chime in if you have any other thoughts. But it's not too late for people to get policies in general. Like if you want a policy, you can get a policy. It's the exemption process that hasn't changed. You can if you can find an insurance carrier.
Yeah, I was going to say a lot of the insurance carriers have pulled out of the state, or a lot of set minimums of $2,000 or $3,000, which for a policy that used to cost $300 to now cost $2,000 or $3,000.
Yeah, and so my other role is executive director for Business Health Trust, and we actually have a partnership where we've been able to connect people with brokers. So, the chamber is happy to facilitate that too. But again, that exemption process hasn't changed yet. So getting policies for yourself or for your company for the right thing to do, or to help your employees age well, et cetera, or to prepare for changes is absolutely possible. It also doesn't mean that you're going to be able to be exempt from the process, because as it stands now, the November 1st exemption date hasn't changed, right?
Correct.
If I get a policy today, that's great. I have a policy. Doesn't mean anything with this
Right.
this program.
And I doubt that they will change that rule, even though it makes sense. And if the purpose is to encourage people to have policies, you think that would be good. I don't think they're going to change that. There's a serious actuarial problem here, which you can probably speak to better than I can. But between the 470,000 people who already got their own policies and opted out, approximately 5 times what everybody projected, notwithstanding the fact that they gave people that short window, and all the new classes of potential exemptions, people who commute to Washington to work, people who are on non-immigrant visas, 70% or more disabled veterans who have a service-related disability, active duty service spouses and significant others, or domestic partners of active duty service. When you add all those up, nobody knows what that number is. We're already at almost 1/3 of the state exempting out. Actuarially, I don't think it takes much more to tip this program into, if not the insolvency of paid family leave, but at least into serious premium reset that's going to scare some people.
Mm-hmm. The other factor there in terms of the solvency is that you have a lot of higher income wage earners that had policies or were able to obtain them. And that percentage, right? I mean, it acted as an income tax in a lot of ways of 0.5% of wages. So the contribution to the program is significantly off kilter right now. And, it's going to take some time to sort through this for the actuaries to get new numbers and to figure out what this all means. and then to start to say, okay, well, do we open up the exemption again? Do we change X, Y, Z? Can we as a state change X, Y, Z? So I, all of that, like that glass of wine, and you could probably go crazy trying to think about all of the what ifs that could happen with the program. So my next question for you is, talk to us about, so there were two bills, one paused the program, and we talked about what that means. What was the other bill, and what did that do?
The other bill simply created exemptions for several classes of people, and I think I've named them. One was spouses and domestic partners of active duty servicemen, service personnel. If you're already on 70% disability or more from a service-related injury, you're out because you've already got VA benefits that's going to be covering you. If you are live out of state but commute to Washington to work, and that's an interesting one, because it's one thing, you've got a lot of people in Idaho and in Oregon who commute every day. You also have some groups that are strange, like pilots, that were saying, we shouldn't be, just because we're based out of Washington, we shouldn't be subject to it. And that on its surface sounds compelling, but I know a lot of pilots that use Washington state as their residency because we don't have an income tax. I mean, statistically, pilots live in one of about 4 states, and Washington is one of them. Now that might change with this tax, and it might change, but they're expecting to be exempt from this. I don't know how you say you're a resident of Washington and therefore not subject to state income tax in any other state, but you shouldn't be subject to this tax because most of the time you're flying somewhere else. There's another group that was exempt. Oh, people on non-immigrant visas. So you've got, and then there's a whole slew of provisions. If you're on a non-immigrant visa and you convert to an immigrant visa, then you have 90 days to tell your employer and the state that you're no longer exempt. And if you don't do that within 90 days, there's you have to pay all back premiums plus a 1% per month. I mean, you can just imagine how this is going to work, right? Okay, and all the administrative agencies that are responsible for policing this, there's going to be issues, right? I mean, you get divorced from your active duty military personnel, or they cease being active, and now you're supposed to remember to tell the state that now you're subject to this tax that you probably don't even know exists. And if not, the state's going to hit you with a big penalty.
Yeah.
It's got problems.
That one kind of made my head spin a bit, just thinking about all of the ifs and stuff. But it sounds like that's the start of some of the changes that they're talking through, right? There have been a lot of questions in the chat around the timing of things, right? We have the program being paused for 18 months and people having a feeling of uncertainty. And Brad, I'd love to invite you to come back. And one question I'd love to talk about is, what do you think will happen this session, right? If we're looking at just the next few months to give people a beacon of what might be happening over this next 18 months from the legislature, and any timelines to hey, tune in around this, this might be a discussion at the end of session or those sorts of things.
Well, again, from an actual legislative perspective, I don't think that there's going to be much, certainly the rest of this session. There may be some activity next session before the 18 months is out. I think you will, though, hear an enormous amount of political rhetoric, both within the legislative session and then into the campaign trail. As folks head off, we have state elections next year, so all of the House members and half of the Senate are up for election next November. I can almost guarantee that this will be a prominent element within for everybody. And that is probably, other than talk, in the absence of, again, litigation all of a sudden getting wings, and or an initiative effort that gathers the signatures for a repeal or some other. The last one that they tried to do was just opening up the opt-out, which basically would have probably eliminated the program in and of itself. But something like that those kinds of things will be happening in the next 6 months. Certainly on the initiative side, you have to gather signatures, have it in by, I believe, mid-July, and then the election will happen in November. If that comes to pass, then we will have whatever the outfall from that initiative certainly in front of us in next November, or I mean in next session.
Right.
In the absence of any of those things happen, I think certainly the majority parties right now will try and spend as little time as possible and let that long-term care work group do what it's supposed to do, which is finding options and getting ideally real numbers and real actuarial analysis that they can feel confident in. I mean, I know I'm not being clear as we'd like, but that is the reality. Is there's not going to be a lot of official action between now and next, 18 months from now, unless there is a forcing function, such as either an initiative or a litigation.
Yeah, and on the litigation front, so I dropped a few links in the chat for everyone, including an article from Lewis on the topic we've been talking about, and also an article about a lawsuit that was filed in November against the program. We've been following that pretty closely for our employers, and we've been hearing, kind of a 6-month. We will have a good feel of where that's going. If if it's going to appeal after repeal after appeal, or settlement or something like that. So, one of the things I've been putting in my brain is, okay, we have session and we'll see what the legislature is talking about, some of the actuarial reports that come out. And shortly thereafter, we'll probably have some sort of beacon on at least this lawsuit. I think we expect several others to be filed as well, that could, just give employers and people a beacon of where things might be going if it's, over the next 18 months. All of this to process, of course, with a beverage of choice to relax the mind, maybe your coffee in the morning, or sit on a beach in your office looking at a beautiful background, right?
I'm not going to live this down, am I, Sarah?
I love it. So I use that background quite often, and it makes it easier to talk about, the legislature, lawsuits, and long-term care when you're looking at a beach. So great. So Louis, any last thoughts or advice for employers as they are navigating this, or things that you think that they should pay attention to?
No.
You had told me earlier today that your advice is to do nothing, meaning pay people back and then just wait.
And just wait.
And just wait.
And I've been following the lawsuit. Okay. It was brought by one of our competitor law firms. They're smart people. I looked at that on behalf of some clients that wanted to bring a lawsuit. And I said, this is really hard. It's complicated. And the problem is if some of the most offensive provisions, you could win and then the legislation could change. Well, some of the most offensive provisions, like taxing people who live out of state, not paying, requiring people near retirement to pay in and not get any benefits out, those provisions, which were the most offensive, have now been removed. So while I wish the litigation well, and I think they've got some really creative arguments, but it's hard. And I think this is best suited for a political solution if our if people could talk across the aisle.
Yes. I agree with that. Conversation always brings the best solutions here. So, well, thank you guys both for this quick conversation as things were coming through the pipeline last week. You know, again, here at the Chamber, we want to bring experts directly to our employers, to employees, to hear, yes, you can sort through the news and such, but to be able to hear from Lewis, from Brad, what you are seeing, what your knowledge base is. This is incredibly helpful. And we're so thankful for you both taking the time today to process through a few things with us and to give employers that very important advice to do nothing, right? And it is, we're sitting in a spot where it is a little bit of wait and see, but it's helpful to hear and to process through together. A reminder to everyone listening today that this will be posted on the Chamber's website later today, as well as you'll receive a post-event email with a link to the download and recording, as well as a link to the Lane Powell article and the legislation itself. I hope everyone has a wonderful day, and thank you both for your time. Take care.
Stay well, everybody.
Bye.
Take care.